Episode 20 of Cave Cat's movie and TV reviews. I can hardly believe it. Anyway, this is Cave Cat again with another exciting episode. And guess what? For the 20th episode, I'm going to be talking about another show featuring a dog, as well as the fourth PBS series that I'm reviewing, and the third live-action series that I've reviewed overall. So what's the story, Wishbone? That's right. Today, I'll be talking about Wishbone. This was another show that I remember watching a lot when I was younger, back when it used to air on PBS in the 90s, and even airing in reruns well into the early 2000s. But anyway, enough beating around the bush. It's time to talk about the show itself. The show follows the adventures of the eponymous character Wishbone, a Jack Russell Terrier who seems ordinary, but is not really so ordinary after all. Why? Because Wishbone is actually revealed to be very intelligent, with the ability to convey his thoughts into human speech, due to the fact that he's very well versed in all sorts of literature of the past centuries. The plot of the show is that Wishbone is the pet of a boy named Joe Talbot, who lives with his mother Ellen in the fictional Texan town of Oakdale. Of course, other characters of the show include Joe's best friends Samantha Kepler, Sam for short, who lives with her father due to her parents being divorced, and David Barnes, who lives with his family, consisting of his mother, his father, and younger sister Emily. And as for Joe, we learned that his father died from a rare blood disease back when Joe was 6 years old. And as for other recurring characters of the series, there's Wanda Gilmore, Joe's next-door neighbor who has a passion for gardening but gets annoyed if Wishbone is digging in her garden, Bob Pruitt, who is the kids' teacher at their school and whom Wanda has a crush on, which he returns, DeMont Jones, the local bully who often antagonizes Joe and the others, but more often than not he often gets inconvenienced thanks to Wishbone, and a few others. Then in the second season, we are introduced to Travis Del Rio, the owner of the Oakdale Sports and Games store, his niece Melina and his nephew Marcus, along with DeMont's younger cousin Jimmy, who has a tendency to make up outrageous stories, which annoys the other characters. But anyway, I mentioned earlier that Wishbone, the main character, is very well versed in different forms of literature. The reason I say this is because in every episode, whenever Joe and his friends have a problem of some sort, Wishbone notes that the problem is very similar to a famous book or myth of some kind. For example, there was an episode where Wishbone is blamed by a lot of the neighbors for various messes all over the neighborhood, with the plot of that episode bearing parallel to the Sherlock Holmes story The Hound of the Baskervilles. And at the end of the episode, Wishbone is cleared when it turns out that it was actually a bloodhound that was causing the messes. Yeah, this show actually covers a lot of classic literature by such authors as Mark Twain, Charles Dickens, Washington Irving, George Eliot, Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, Robert Louis Stevenson, Alexander Dumas, and many, many others. In fact, to tell you the truth, this show is how I became familiar with so many classic literature stories, while they did retell stories that I was already familiar with, like Robin Hood, David and Goliath, and even the legend of Sleepy Hollow. I really like the concept of having Wishbone, the little dog with the big imagination, as the tagline referred to him as, imagining himself as the pivotal or supporting character in various classic literature stories, because I felt that it was a great way to really get kids invested in learning more about classic literature and actually reading more. In some ways, it's a little bit similar to Adventures from the Book of Virtues, being that that show also focused on telling stories from different cultures. However, the only difference between Wishbone and Adventures from the Book of Virtues is that while Adventures from the Book of Virtues was animated and generally told more than one story per episode, barring the third season, which only had one story told throughout per episode, Wishbone was live action and had Wishbone being the one telling the story within the corresponding episode, with short breaks in between the story. At least it's a good way for the audience to really take in what's going on and to actually be invested in the story. The show ran for 2 seasons from October 1995 to December 1997, even airing during the time that Kino's Storytime, another PBS series that I previously reviewed, was still in its quote-unquote second season. Also, even in spite of the fact that this show had to compete with other PBS kids shows at the time, like Kratts' Creatures, The Puzzle Place, and The Magic School Bus, it still proved to be popular with kids and even adults because of its concept of a dog exploring various forms of classic literature. Not to mention that Wishbone himself is also a fun character that the audience can really identify with, because despite being a dog, he's very brave, intelligent, and savvy, while also being rather goofy, silly, and quick-witted. And there's also the running gag where he often complains about nobody ever listening to him just because he's a dog and can't actually talk to them. The show actually has a pretty good mix of comedy, emotion, and heart-pounding moments to it, especially in the episode that retold the story of the legend of Sleepy Hollow, as I've mentioned earlier. It's kind of a shame that the show ended up getting canceled after the second season, because there were still so many classic literature stories that had not yet been adapted. Fortunately, after the show ended, they were able to publish quite a good number of books in the Adventures of Wishbone line, which had the same structure of the show, adapting some episodes from the show, which also have original stories that adapted classic literature stories that were not covered in the show, like Beowulf, Robinson Crusoe, The Man in the Iron Mask, Moby Dick, Kidnapped, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, The Last of the Mohicans, Gulliver's Travels, King Solomon's Mines, Huckleberry Finn, and even The Legion of Space and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Then in 1998, a year after the second season ended, a direct-to-video film called Wishbone's Dog Days of the West was released, which retold several short stories from O. Henry's Heart of the West. I actually like this one, because I don't think I've told you before, but I'm actually a sucker for good westerns most of the time. Another thing that I should point out about Wishbone himself is that Larry Brantley did a great job voicing him, giving them that comedic and witty yet intelligent and tactful atmosphere about him. And to think that this was even years before he went on to voice the villainous Hody Jones in the English dub of One Piece, but that's just another can of worms. Though to be fair, I've not really watched One Piece anyway, considering the fact that I've heard about how 4Kids, the company that dubbed the series, just made a complete mess of it in its voice acting and especially in its scenarios and character portrayal. But back to Wishbone, PBS really did a great job with the show, giving kids a chance to be exposed to various forms of classic literature, to learn more about various classic literature and the authors of the past that wrote said stories. Like a lot of kids in the past, I really enjoyed Wishbone for its main character and especially for its retellings of different literature stories. So I think it's safe to say that the show gets 8 stars from me. Simple as that. So I heard back in 2020 that Universal and Mattel, under their film division, will be producing a feature-length film based on Wishbone. While I'm excited to hear this news, I'm also a little bit cautious about it, because as I've mentioned before in my The New Adventures of Winnie the Pooh review, sometimes feature films based on live-action shows of the past just don't work out all that well, especially if the producers decide to completely disregard everything that made the original great and just mess up a lot of things about the source material. Not to mention that Peter Farrelly has also been attached to the film as a producer, after directing such films as Dumb and Dumber, Kingpin, There's Something About Mary, Me, Myself, and Irene, Osmosis Jones, and even the 2012 Three Stooges film. It makes me worried about if Peter Farrelly will actually try to stay true to the Wishbone series or if he'll just completely turn it into an offbeat comedy about a talking dog who loves classic literature. And also, speaking of which, I've noticed that in the past 3 decades, a lot of live-action films featuring talking animals seem to face a lot of pitfalls, such as using CGI effects to make the animals talk by moving their mouths. I'm kind of afraid that that's what's going to happen to Wishbone if the film does enter production, because in the original series, Wishbone didn't talk by moving his mouth. He just conveyed his thoughts into human speech that only the audience could understand. Using CGI to make Wishbone talk by moving his mouth would just completely ruin the film altogether if that happened. And I imagine that the same thing will also happen if Disney decides to make a remake of their 1978 live-action film The Cat from Outer Space, which I hope it doesn't. But of course, only time will tell, as they always say. So anyway, that about wraps it up for this episode of Cave Cat's Movie and TV Reviews. As mentioned before, be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more videos from me, whether they're more episodes or something else. Until next time, later!